Welcome back to our COP30 mini series. We are at the finish line, and after weeks of intense negotiations, we finally have what is being called as one of the most important outcome packages since Paris. So that's from finance roadmap and a global carbon market coalition to India's growing role in the global south leadership. COP30 seems to have delivered both on progress and pressure points. So, in this final episode of this mini series, we'll unpack what it all actually means for countries, for climate policy, and for the coming decade of implementation. So, hi again, Archana. Thanks one more time to simplify this all down for us. And heads up, you'll hear a lot of please tell us more in this episode.
Thanks for having me again, Manjari. And yes, it's a big milestone in some ways, what has happened in Belem, and in various ways. So yes, very happy to talk through and actually also in the process, go over what has been discussed at COP and if kind of refresh my own thoughts on it. So thank you.
Perfect. Great. So, and that's absolutely the intention. I have made some notes from the main outcomes, and one by one, maybe we can touch base on unpacking what each of them mean. The first one I wanted to dive into was the Global Implementation Accelerator, which intends to close the gap between where the national plans are currently and what is actually needed to keep warming below 1.5 degree rise. So, what does this actually mean and change for countries like India?
Hmm. The Global Implementation Accelerator sounds like a very technical term, actually. But from what we understand, in reality, it's actually just one simple shift. It's about going from, so what are you promising? That used to be the question to the developed countries as well as to, the parties that are present. What are you promising? Instead of that, it is going to shift the kaleidoscope a bit and say, so what are you actually doing and who will pay for this? Who will help pay for this? Let's say. So it's that kind of a shift. And this kind of the accelerator together with the Belem mission to 1.5 degrees is meant to track how countries are implementing their NDCs, national adaptation plans, and how they are matching them with finance technology, and then report back to the COP on what is working and what isn't working. So, for a country like India, this kind of cuts in two ways. It's the positive thing is that it creates one space to kind of showcase the heavy lifting that we're already doing. Domestically, there's so much that India is doing that it can talk about, from our renewables and our energy efficiency programs to demand support that basically, you know, aligns with our development priorities. So that is that links then to the Baku to Belem finance roadmap and the new long-term finance goal. So in theory, there's a clearer pipeline from need to funding or money, but it does not magically create new money. So it does not really change the legal obligation that developed countries must provide for funding through public climate finance under Article 9.1. So this language that it uses is mostly calls on and encourages, and uh, you know, if you're not really careful, the implementation can become more of do more with whatever you have for yourselves in your countries, and for countries that are already juggling debt stretched, the smaller countries who already have climate losses and have basic development needs, they might feel even more burdened. But for
Hmm.
India, the test might be that this accelerator could help us unlock more concessional and grant based finance for, say, our transition, our energy transition, for building more climate resilient infrastructure, for adaptation. Or it could, on the other hand, just add another reporting burden, which
Hmm.
hopefully does not happen without changing any of the money flows. So that is a risk also. It just depends on how things play out.
Right. So it could go either way, but we're hopeful that it will be used to just drive better finance and to drive faster climate action. And that makes a good segue for my follow up question, which was around it's a broad one, just to understand the key outcomes on the finance agenda item. I know there was a lot of tussle around it. So just wanted to understand what were the outcomes on the finance bit and what does this signal for developing economies who are already battling stress and climate impacts?
Yeah, that was the big question, wasn't it, at this COP? And something that everybody was watching. And I was just going over my notes, and essentially seems like COP30 did like three big things, and one thing it completely ducked. So when it comes to the first thing that it has done is basically the Belem Mutirao decision, where it calls on tripling adaptation finance by 2035. Now, there are texts that refer to various figures in this, $120 billion a year, some say some other figure. But in terms of, although it doesn't give you like a figure in terms of what that tripling of adaptation finance by 2035 will look like, what it does do is it wins the battle of signaling. So far, the focuses at COPs have been so much more on mitigation. This time, now we're saying, okay, adaptation is not a footnote. It is not going to be something that happens also, but it is the day-to-day problem to be dealt with. So that framing is very important. Although the developing countries were pushing for a 2030 tripling for adaptation finance. 2035 is not ideal, but also because there's no clear baseline, and much of it is like framed as a highly concessional loans, mix of grants. So it basically again does the same thing that bringing all possible sources of funding, but at least it brings adaptation front and center, which is a big. Second, what COP30 does is they did is that it leaned on new long-term finance goals that were anchored in Baku. So the Baku to Belem roadmap, which talked about $1.3 trillion a year for developing countries by 2035, uh, that's supposed to show how public, private, multilateral flows, all kinds of uh, money flows add up to that 1.3 trillion. Again, directionally, absolutely fine, but the language is still about mobilizing private capital. There is no mandating climate public finance, so that is where it stands. On the loss and damages fund, it has replenishment cycle is confirmed. So the first calls for proposal are now moving. There's the total pledges, they have now risen just above some $800 million. That is, however, only symbolic, because what really is required for loss and damage is hundreds of billions actually every year. And we are seeing that as impacts rise. But that's not where we stand with their loss and damage replenishment and where the pledges are. But that is what the third thing was. What it does do for debt stressed economies is that it tells them that the system basically now recognizes their reality. So, adaptation, loss and damage, just transition. These are all these were all the main focus points in this particular COP. It the downside is that it still talks about loans, guarantees, instruments, instead of talking about predictable grant based public finance, which is what the developing countries have been asking for. And especially finance that doesn't worsen their debt problem. So those are things that are risks that could deepen even further if these things are not really tackled. But uh, that is where we are at with finance. Does it move us closer to where we want to be in terms of actual delivery of funds and money flows? Maybe very little, because there are clear targets, there's replenishment cycles, there's implementation work plans. But there is a big gap. The numbers that we're talking, that is there on the paper, the numbers in national budgets, the zero number that we have from developed countries being able to say, hey, these are the kind of public funds we'll be making available. That battle is still ongoing. So for India, developing economies like India, the next phase will obviously be about turning all these political signals that Belem gave us into actual money flows, and in a way that it they don't have a rising debt burden, or they don't have to compromise their development priorities in any way. So that is
Hmm.
the sum of what I understand in terms of finance.
Yeah, I think that's very useful to know that outcomes are also not just about winning numbers, but winning salience. And it's heartening to know that some i- important critical issues got their well deserved limelight with the unlocking of the adaptation funds. And I just had a follow up question. Are these still seen as voluntary contributions and pledges, or is there any obligation when it comes to the new commitments that were made?
That is what I was trying to say, that there is no clear sign of where the funds will flow from. We still
Okay.
have only, so we haven't moved the needle too much on that. What we
Okay.
have moved the needle is on the you know, political aspects. We are speaking about the things that, and speaking about them in terms of, we've rearranged our priorities. We've said, okay, this is what really is hitting us. This is what needs to be managed. This is what will require funds. Now, where those funds will come from, how those funds will be mobilized, whether there is provision versus mobilization, the old 9.1 argument, that still is in the mix somewhere
Hmm.
and still needs to be dealt with. So that's the story probably for the next COP.
Right. So that also offers me a segue to talk about the Integrated Forum on Climate and Trade. For countries like India, it's quite significant because they've pushed back against unilateral measures like CBAM. So, how significant was this outcome?
I think this is one of those wins of Belem, at least personally, from whatever I have been studying on CBAM and on unilateral trade measures. This is actually a pretty big deal, simply because for years now, climate, trade, they've been colliding, but there has been no space really to discuss this in any of the negotiations. So in at the WTO, it was not discussed because the countries planning these measures talk said that this was a climate policy measure. And at UNFCCC, it couldn't be discussed because it was called a WTO or a trade measure. So there wasn't really a platform or a place where these very contentious issues could be discussed. Now, Brazil's Integrated Forum on Climate and Trade is designed like a 3 year dialogue where governments will explore how trade rules and climate, they can, whether they undermine each other, whether they can come together, but at least there's a place where this can be discussed. And alongside that, if you see the Mutirao decision, which asks the UNFCCC subsidiary bodies. So SB 64, SB 66, SB 68. And it says, it asks these bodies to hold regular conversations with the WTO, with UNCTAD, with ITC on these unilateral trade measures. This is the first time that a COP has actually explicitly acknowledged that measures like CBAM are climate and trade issues, and they belong on the UNFCCC agenda, and that they should be or can be discussed there. So for India, for instance, we've consistently called CBAM a form of green protection. We've said that it's a violation of equity, Article 3.5 of the convention. And for us, this is a significant procedural win because it creates a multilateral space where developing countries can now document the impact of the various impacts, not just one, but multiple impacts of such a measure. And where they can argue that, basically the burden of mitigation of, in the global north basically now burdens the global south. And there is a body where they can push for norms. They can talk about setting standards on how any border measure should be designed. And that is a big thing. And more importantly, not just should be designed, but where should the revenue go?
Hmm.
But will this forum actually stop CBAM? No, it will not. The EU is already implementing it. The UK is talking about it. We know Japan, Australia, US. We know that other developed economies are also exploring similar measures. But it does give India and the other developing countries leverage to say that if you insist on doing those measures, seeing those measures through, then they must be consistent with CBDRRC. They should avoid
Hmm.
double counting. And ideally, a share of the revenue of climate finance should come to the affected countries. So it means that trade can no longer be treated as something that is a separate issue. And trade becomes a part of the climate justice, conversation, which is a very big win. So I think, yeah, this is one of those really big wins from Belem.
Yes, I think we did see India being quite vocal around key decisions that were finally made on finance, equity, justice, and transition. Um, just wanted to also explore further what India's position has been through this COP, because the COP has this time demonstrated a new era of global South-led multilateralism, and just wanted to understand what do you think this means for future negotiations?
That's a good question. Also, because the way India conducted itself, the leadership that India showed this COP was really exceptional in some ways. It was very its interventions that we made. They constantly came back to two three themes, and so we were focused on equity, finance. We talked about development space. We framed COP30 as COP of implementation, which basically meant don't give us new targets without new money. That's what it meant. So, and we also repeatedly hammered the message that promises made in Rio 33 years ago on public climate finance are still not fulfilled. So, it seemed like India had actually come with a very well thought out strategy. We did not submit our NDCs because even before the submission, we had made it very clear that we would like to see the ambition that the developed countries and folks who are supposed to help developing countries, with resources to transition, what they bring to the table before we actually make any promises. So we did push hard just transition mechanism. We actually warned that the transition cannot be copy pasted from Europe. There was, I mean, if you listened to our negotiators, it was very heartening to see that whether it was just transition or whether it was unilateral trade measures, they actually stood up and they made very valid points and they were very lucid in how they messaged as global south leaders. India was representing the LMDC. India talked on behalf of basic even at the final plenary. The support that India gave Brazil, the Brazilian presidency, the support that the fact that China, India, Brazil, even Russia, everybody was speaking, so to speak, they were singing in the same choir, which was very interesting to watch. And in some ways, personally, I think this was like a BRICS, COP. This was a BRICS led COP in many ways, not to undermine or in any way not consider the leadership shown by other developing nations at the COP. But you could see that there was a strategy. You could see that our positioning was on point. And you could see that we absolutely were, for instance, on trade, we were the strongest voice, one of the strongest voice, which demanding that, CBAM should be discussed under UNFCCC. And on finance, our messaging was very aligned with vulnerable nations on how adaptation must have equal priority. Finance must be public and predictable and grant based. Wherever possible, we put that out. So, has our positioning changed? We are we're not seen as like a big we are a major emitter, but like every COP, we are in some way in the limelight by the end of the COP as folks who are the reluctant big emitter, not really doing enough. This time I thought, and I do think that from even the conversations I'm having with others, India came across as the system shaper on behalf of the global south. And the fact that they could argue fiercely on equity and trade, they could also talk about rolling out renewables at scale, they could talk about building alliances in solar, green hydrogen, nature. So you can see that they were building, they turned up as leaders. And if we are raising our hand to be to lead the presidency in the coming future, very near future, then we behave like the leaders that we want to be seen as. And on for future negotiations, I think particularly if there is an Indian COP later in this decade, this COP kind of created both the opportunity. It showed that we take responsibility, and I think we've claimed that mantle of climate justice, South-led multilateralism. And next will be to see how we match that with action in the next 2 3 years, and how we continue to talk as leaders of the global South over the next 2 3 years. So yeah, it was very interesting to watch India this year.
The other thing I wanted to explore were the two important roadmaps that were introduced, one on transitioning away from fossil fuels and the other on deforestation and procedures to halt. Could you again tell us a little more about how that can meaningfully shift the global energy and land use decisions, or do you think that might remain voluntary?
Okay, this is, I think, where uh, Belem kind of raised expectations for everybody. There was a lot of anticipation because the presidency had talked about this. And of course, they actually hosted the COP in Belem, which is a rainforest area. And so there was a lot of expectation in terms of what would be said on deforestation, on fossil fuels, something that the presidency had themselves talked up before the COP. And now there is a feeling that they kind of underdelivered on it. Inside the formal COP text, so there are references to binding roadmaps for phasing down fossil fuel, uh, halting deforestation. All of this was stripped out. We saw that it came out in like one draft of the Mutirao text, but then the final draft didn't have it. And there was really no UN agreed kind of fossil fuel or deforestation roadmap in any of the legal outcomes. What the presidency did instead was that they launched these two voluntary roadmaps outside the core decisions. One is, of course, the transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is a coalition to work on it. And second was to halt and reverse deforestation. And this was backed by 80 plus 80, 90 countries. And that is where we saw the friction even in the final plenary, where countries basically raised objections and said, if this is not in the legal document, then we don't accept a lot of this. And because those decisions had the legal documents and the legal agreements had already been gathered, it couldn't be reopened. And so now these will be pursued through political coalitions. That was the decision that finally came out when the presidency, they suspended the plenary for a while, if you remember, and then they had their conversations. And when they came back, then it was announced that these two things, the fossil fuel phase out, as well as the a roadmap for fossil fuel phase out and a roadmap for deforestation, these will be pursued through political coalitions. So now there will be a fossil fuel phase out conference in Colombia next year, and nature focused finance platforms like the Tropical Forests Forever facility, which has already mobilized, I think, I'm not sure whether $6 or $7 billion in the first phase, and a significant share of indigenous and local communities backing this. So now you have that as a parallel, uh, discussion that is outside the UNFCCC legal remit. Does that actually shift things in the real world? Maybe, if there are standards that they talk about, you know, finance standards and how public banks or private investors, whether there are going to be timelines for new oil and gas and coal approvals, whether there is going to be serious finance that will come into, forests, Congo, Amazon, elsewhere, including India. So whether these two coalitions then or conversations then can create political pressure on others, by in some ways, that needs to be seen. But we have to remember that whatever comes out of that is not binding. So countries can
Mm.
sign up, they can delay their plans at home, and they can still say we are aligned. So, from a global south perspective, there is a risk that these voluntary roadmaps become another place where rules are written, which is what has happened in multiple forums, where rules are written, finance is talked about, advantages are created for some, but there are no hard guarantees. There is no talk of equity. There's no talk of finance. There's no actual technology transfer that a formal UN decision can carry. And for India, maybe the smart thing to do would be to engage in these coalitions, but also our policy has been to talk about how any roadmaps have to come with finance, have to come with support, and basically that a one size fits all doesn't work for everyone. And I think that is where the deforestation and fossil fuel phase out conversations were.
Great. Thanks for that roundup on all of the important outcomes. I'm sure there are a lot more, but I think we have covered the critical, aspects. One last question, Archana, was that we saw this time at the Belem COP a lot of indigenous participation, and just wanted to understand: do you think it made a mark and became a prominent part of the outcomes? Did it make any impact on the negotiations? We didn't see a lot of that in the last two COPs, but this time there was a lot of indigenous participation.
True. This time there was a lot of indigenous participation. We actually saw there was a mini riot where indigenous people had stormed right into the COP venue, and they were restrained, and there was some news and photographs that were very colorful, very that showed us the agitation and you know the fact that indigenous groups are losing patience with the processes which aren't really hearing them or catering to their needs, and their not really giving them the space that they deserve. The one good thing, if you see with Belem, is that because it was held, the COP itself was held in the Amazon. That, I think, changed the atmosphere. You could see the forest, the fact that indigenous rights didn't have to be talked about, separately, because this was there for everyone to see. And there was a record number of indigenous people's participation. There were thousands of leaders who had traveled to Belem. They were in the co-negotiating zones. They were occupying streets. There was a people's summit, so they were visible. And Brazil actually announced that there was a demarcation of 10 new indigenous territories, and the final decision text actually explicitly references the rights and land rights of indigenous people. That's a big thing. On forests, we saw that new money flowed, over €1 billion from Germany. This tropical forest forever facility, which reserves at least a fifth of their funds for indigenous and local community and for forest protections. So there were pledges. There were pledges for the Congo Basin. But at the end of the day, If we ask, did all of this actually shape the outcome on deforestation, the thing that we just discussed? Whether it is on fossil fuels and the fact that indigenous peoples have been protesting, have been opposing the use of their lands for uh, extraction and drilling and mining. Was their voices, did the needle move on that? The answer is a little more, I think, sobering.
Hmm.
The groups had limited access to the blue zone compared to the number of people who had turned up and the proposals that were made. And, so as for if you talk about formal climate policy metrics, the summit did not really deliver. They did not
Hmm.
deliver for the indigenous communities, and they really many of the indigenous leaders later, they called it tokenism. Also, there were stories talking about how they felt about it. And yes, so indigenous participation was prominent, than more prominent than ever before. Marches, storytelling, they were the at the center of COP, and it did help them secure some gains and in terms of finance, in terms of being recognized. But Belem also exposed how far the system still has to go from treating indigenous governance or land rights, and talk about whether it is informed consent for their resources. These are not really things that Belem covered itself in the audio work, and that's where I think the disappointment still lies.
Hmm. Yeah, that is a tad bit disappointing, but it's also heartening to know how many Indigenous communities made the effort to claim that space and to ensure that in the center of climate conversations is not, the goal is not finance. Finance is the means, it's the medium, but the goal is people and justice and, a good future for all of us. So I'm glad that at least, that space was claimed, and I hope that their voices echoed through the big halls at the COP in Belem. Yeah, thanks so much, Archana. That wraps up our conversation at the moment.
Thanks, Manjari. This was helpful even for me to be able to go over the entire 2 weeks of what really mattered at COP. So thank you.
I'm sure there is still a lot like in our heads to make sense of, because while the outcomes are not perfect, but they in a way set the direction for many years ahead on several aspects and global cooperation, and a lot for us to watch. I guess what happens now will matter far more than what was announced in the halls, over the last 2 weeks. So, yes, as always, we'll keep tracking how these commitments translate more into action. And that's all for this episode. And thanks everybody for listening. And we'll continue following the climate story beyond COP. So,